The video game scene is booming around the world, and yes, in Switzerland too. With innovations and initiatives, Swiss companies are present at the largest gaming conferences and amongst its winners too. And in recent years, more and more conferences are being held in Switzerland. Games create the opportunities for you and me to be in a new role, a new environment, to attempt and achieve new tasks. They even give us the ability to be invincible and have that second chance. With the incredible advances in technology, the experiences of players and game designers have evolved as well, leading to new types of narrative creation, experimental formats, and applications. So let's dive in. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jordan Erica Weber. Jordan is a video game reporter and expert. She works with the BBC, The Guardian, The Gadget Show, and she most recently co-authored the book titled 10 Things Video Games Can Teach Us about life, philosophy, and everything. And of course, she is also an avid gamer herself. Jordan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Roberta, for that kind introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And I also want to add a special thank you to anyone who, like me, is from the UK, because you are missing the football to be here. So I am eternally grateful for that. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I am also thrilled to be joined by two wonderful panelists, Philomena and Patrick. Their extended bios can be found on the Goethe website, and you can find links to some of their work there. I think Irmi is also going to be adding links in the chat as well. So there'll be more information there. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves for you now so that you can get the word from them. I'm going to ask them to tell you a little bit about what they do, specifically how their work relates to an interest in the ways we explore narrative in games as well, because that is what we're here to talk about today. So Philomena, if you want to switch on your camera and your microphone and go first for us, that would be amazing.
Hi everybody, I'm Philomena from Strafon studio. We're a 10-people indie team from Zurich, Switzerland, and we have made 3 games so far: niche genetic survival game, Nimbatus the space drone constructor, and currently working on the 3rd one, which is called The Wandering Village. And yeah, I'm also involved with the Game Hub and Incubator here in Zurich and with the local Swiss Game Developers Association. And yeah, I love games and I love narrative in games. I'm very much looking forward to this talk with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Philomena. And Patrick, how about you?
Hi, I'm Patrick Jagoda. I'm a faculty member at the University of Chicago, and I'm both in the English department, where I think about things like narrative, and in cinema media studies, where I think about the kind of medium-specific qualities of video games. And in addition to studying video games, I also design both digital games and alternate reality games with a real emphasis on storytelling.
So definitely an interesting topic for both of you then. Thank you so much for your introductions. To those of you watching at home, as Irmi said, you will get the opportunity to ask questions. So do type your questions into the chat as they come to you. Make sure you let us know where you're coming from and who your question is for as well. So obviously, given Patrick's experience with transmedia and Philomena's with making games that I would say push the boundaries of the medium and do something quite different, I thought we would try contextualizing our conversation about narrative in games by comparing them to other media like film, television, and books. So Philomena, I'm actually going to start with you, and this is a big question, so I hope that's okay. When it comes to telling stories, what advantages do games have?
Yeah, well, probably the most obvious one is just the interactivity, so that you are actually in the role of the protagonist and really get to decide what is happening. So the whole interactivity, there's many examples of that, such as like multilinear games where there's different ways, decisions you make that lead to different endings, or things like emergent stories, like if the story really comes from the game mechanics in the game, players making their own stories where mechanics interact with each other and just generate stories on the fly. It's just so many new ways of how a story can be told.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned both multilinear and emergent, because those are two things that I wanted to touch on more in a second. But Patrick, I'll give you a chance to answer the question first.
Sure. I mean, I think games introduce forms of storytelling that we didn't really have before in the same form. So if you pick up a novel, for instance, that'll convey a narrative in a linear fashion. So every time I pick up Toni Morrison's Beloved or N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season or something like that, the details are different. I notice different details, but the words remain in the same order. So I think that nonlinearity and multilinearity are so important to games. And this goes back all the way to like the late 1970s when you had choose your own adventure books and also text adventure games. But the kind of multiple pathways didn't really take off in a super vibrant form in video games until the 2000s, when we saw games like BioShock, for instance, which gave a very limited number of endings. And games have become much more complex narratively since that point. You have games like Nier Automata that have something like 25 endings, or Fate Stay Night, which has almost 50 endings. But it isn't just about endings. It's also about decisions and forms of responsibility and meaning that you take on while you're playing a game. So it's about experimenting within the possibility space of the game, which is something you can't quite do with a novel unless you're interpreting it on the other end.
That's really interesting. I do quickly want to mention, because you mentioned choose your own adventure books there. I want to give a shout out to a newsletter series that I've been subscribed to called 50 Years of Text Games by Aaron A. Reed. I don't know if you've been reading it, either of you, but it's really, really good. So if people are interested in those kind of old school choose your own adventure style games, definitely one to check out. But let's talk about multilinear games then, since both of you mentioned that. Patrick, you mentioned the kind of number of endings that are available in a lot of games. I want to ask you, so, developers talk a lot about how a lot of the kind of money and energy goes into the beginning of a game because they know everyone will see that bit, and then the number of people who finish kind of drops off. And that must be even worse for games with multiple endings. I know, for example, I've been playing Mass Effect Legendary Edition recently. And there are the two kind of moral choices. You either go the Paragon route or the Renegade route. And the developers have said 90% of people go the kind of quote unquote good guy route. So a lot of people don't see the other stuff. So does this kind of having multiple possibilities of the way the narrative can go, does it dilute the story that can be told in a game? I don't know if either of you have strong opinions on that. Do you want to go first, Patrick?
Sure. I mean, I think duration has a lot to do with that, right? I mean, with films, for instance, we're accustomed to watching a film that's maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours, but that's short for a game. Of course, there are games that are that short, but many games are 50 hours, 100 hours, a couple of 100 hours if you're playing multiple routes. So there's a different form of habituation that goes into how we play games versus how we watch films, for instance. But I do think one place that I find that people experience multiple endings is through YouTube, for instance, right? So being able to watch Let's Play videos. So even if you only play a game through once, you might watch all of the other endings when other people are completing them. So there's a kind of extended community that I think maybe doesn't overcome the problem that you're describing it, but it gives people different routes into the story specifically.
Yeah, I'm totally somebody who does that. So when I choose one specific route, then I totally want to know what would have happened if I did it differently. And then I go watch all the endings on YouTube. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, because something I wanted to ask about was the prevalence of Let's Play videos and also streaming. So I've been doing a bit of live streaming lately, twitch.tv/Jerica Weber, if anyone wants to check that out. But narrative games in particular, they lend themselves quite well to live streaming and YouTube videos because they're very engaging to watch. But I know that some developers of narrative games have said that this kind of thing ruins making those kinds of games for them, because who's going to buy a narrative game when you can just watch a video about it? So is there a danger from YouTube and Twitch and things for narrative heavy games?
Yeah, I think there's a... Sorry,
go
ahead, Philomena.
Philomena, you first.
Okay. Well, yeah, so me personally, we make mostly games with emergent storytelling and not so much with linear. So I haven't experienced it myself, but I've seen quite a lot of my developer friends like making streamer versions available maybe a day or two before the game launches that like end after 15 minutes or 30 minutes, so that people are still interested enough to actually go get it themselves. I think YouTubers and streamers just in general have such a big positive effect that it's going to probably net out the negative side effects that it has on linear games. But yeah, Also, a linear game, you usually probably only play it once. And if it's a short one for 2 hours, then you are done maybe after 2 let's plays. And the ones with emergent storytelling or like emergent game mechanics probably are better suited because you can just make longer let's play series of it. But yeah.
What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, no, I think there are like different pleasures in games. So you know, like when you're playing the game yourself and making the decisions, there's a very different sense of responsibility in terms of what happens to the character. So I just think different audiences gravitate toward different aspects of games. And I'm glad that you all both have now brought up emergent storytelling in games as well. This is really, really important as well, right? So for people in the audience maybe who don't play video games as much, there are the stories that a game tells, but there are also the stories that people tell when they play a game, right? So we see this through emergent storytelling, through what's called player-generated narrative. And that's especially true in large open-ended games or sandbox games. So something like the Grand Theft Auto series or Red Dead Redemption series opens up, you know, like hundreds of hours of gameplay and stories that weren't intended by the designers, but that happen because of the interactions between the player and the environment, or between players in a multiplayer or a massively multiplayer game. So those forms of secondary creativity in games are really exciting. And it's not like it doesn't happen in fiction, right? There's like fan fiction, for instance, where people write about the characters that they love in unexpected situations, but that doesn't happen during the aesthetic experience itself, which is unique with games.
Philomena, you work with emergent storytelling in games. Could you give us some examples from your own games of how that kind of thing works?
So maybe firstly, one thing that is still really making me very happy is that like our first game that came out in 2016, the people that are still playing it now are mostly people that are role playing. So it's like, it's a single player game, but people, it's a game about where you have a group of animals and you try to survive like in a hostile environment with climate changes, predators and so on. So you're in charge of your own pack and like what genes are passed on to the next generation and so you automatically have a lot of emergent storytelling, right? Because you have characters that are mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and there's danger happening to them and changes are coming to the tribe and you need to adapt to it. So a lot of stuff just automatically happens when you play. And yeah, I just really like it that people also then seem to give those creatures a personality and say, oh, this is a very shy one and he really cannot cross this border unless there's like 2 of his pack mates next to him. And then they make up these kind of challenges for other players in these story environments. And then, yeah, they imagine just these traits for the creatures, even though they're not really there. So it's really cool to see them come up with their own story and characters within
And that's
the
niche,
mechanical
right?
universe.
That game
Yeah,
is
that's
linked
niche.
in the
Exactly.
chat if people want to check that out.
Mhm.
Awesome. I wonder what you think about the kind of contrast between games that have no real pre-written story and where players come up with the narrative themselves, and then games that are more traditionally, you know, they kind of feed you the narrative, more like a book or a film. How do the kind of emergent narratives fit with the idea of the storyteller and the kind of story listener, viewer, absorber? For instance, like how do you create a game to encourage those kinds of emergent narratives? Can you, or is it something that you can't really predict? Patrick, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, there's such different experiences, right? I mean, when something is a shorter game that's almost cinematic in some ways, there's like a tightness about the experience that you have, and it's almost like a conversation that you're having intimately with the creator. Versus in an emergent situation, maybe you don't have that intimacy and that emotional trajectory that you would in the other case. But there are all of these other new kinds of pleasures that come up, oftentimes with social interactions or forming a community or role playing in ways that were not entirely prescribed within the initial situation. And so there's so much cultural stuff that comes up in an emergent work. But of course, like having the elements at play so someone can go into that play space and make something new of it is really important. But it's to me, it's a very different art, like creating a tight, short, authored narrative versus creating a space from which stories can emerge.
One of my favorite examples of emergent storytelling is RimWorld, which is actually, it's a simulation game where you are like a bunch of people that crash landed on a planet and now you need to establish a colony. And it actually doesn't declare itself as a game. It declares itself as a story generator. And you can very clearly feel that like the game mechanics as they work together were designed to come up with interesting moments for these characters. And like the game graphics is very, very simplistic. So you only have like these little people and they walk around like this, these little 2D people, but they have very specific simulated traits, like every single one of their fingers is simulated, and then you can like check how their health is doing, and they have organs and everything. And through this simulation and through the interaction of these characters, which also all have a lot of personality traits and have like their own flaws, it's really an interesting drama is turning up if this character doesn't like this character, and then something is happening and they can't work together for some reasons. I've never played a game that has generated such interesting stories every time when I play it.
Yeah, simulation games are good for that kind of thing. I guess I would recommend like The Sims, you know, the kind of basic simulation game. And to bring it back to how YouTubers and streamers play a part in this kind of thing, there's a big community of Sims YouTubers and streamers who create all of these kind of narrative challenges that they apply to the simulation that aren't baked into the game, but they're a part of the kind of community that builds up around the game. So yeah, people should definitely check out some YouTubers. Lil Simsy is a good one. But let's bring it back to, like Patrick said, the kind of the difference between people who create these games, these simulations that encourage these emergent narratives, and the people who create the more authored experiences. A lot of people who don't play a lot of games, their idea of what a video game story is might have come from games that rely on things like cutscenes, right? So we've all played games where you play the game bit and then you get to a certain point and a bit of story kind of comes at you. And that's been a traditional way that those kinds of stories are told. How are we moving past that in games? So still sticking with more or less linear plot-driven stories, but moving away from just cutscenes where you're sitting there passively.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first uses of cutscenes that I can think of was in the first Donkey Kong arcade game in the early 1980s. I'm not sure if that was the very first one, but it was certainly early. Or, you know, like I oftentimes think about, you know, this famous Laserdisc game, Dragon's Lair, as being a very kind of like loud early version of a cutscene. And this was basically a game where you're a chivalric knight, and there's this kind of like dragon fantasy narrative, and it was a game that was animated by a Disney animator, so it's beautiful, but the gameplay was extremely basic, right? It basically came down to a series of what we now or recently called QuickTime events, which you would see in games like Quantic Dream's Heavy Rain, or a number of games that they subsequently made. But basically, you'd very quickly have to react using a directional pad and an action button, but the gameplay wasn't very sophisticated, right? It was basically moving between gameplay and these kind of more cinematic cutscenes. But as you're suggesting, like recently, or over the last couple of decades even, designers have tried to integrate storytelling into the game itself, so there isn't quite so much interruption. So the thing you're doing via game mechanic is furthering the story, or the role playing that you're engaging in is furthering the story, rather than having these kinds of interruptions. Like, that being said, though, there are some really huge games that continue to use cutscenes. So Persona 5, for instance, has over an hour of cutscenes through the whole thing, or Death Stranding has something like 7 hours, I think, or 7 to 10 hours of cutscenes, including one cutscene that's 71 minutes long, right? So it's like the length of an entire film, and this is a small subset of the larger game. But I think that there are a lot of interesting ways that designers try to go around that, and for instance, create environments that evoke narratives without telling them, or embed stories within environments through audio recordings that you might find in a game like Fallout 3 or 4, for instance. And I think the main idea is games don't need to imitate films. They should be in conversation with cinema, but they have their own medium-specific qualities, their own ways of telling stories.
Totally agreed.
I like that you mentioned audio recordings there, because you're right that they kind of are being used more and more in games as a way to give the player more control over when they're getting those bits of story. But it still feels like standing there and listening to an audio recording is still quite passive. So I want to talk about the interactivity of games, because this isn't, I mean, we've kind of been talking about it, but we haven't really mentioned the word. That obviously is a big thing that differentiates games from a lot of other media. The fact that they're interactive. How can you make the player feel like they are a part of that story and that they are the ones making things happen? Philomena, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, it very much depends on the world building, right?
Mm.
So the world really needs to feel like the place that it's supposed to be in the game. And I think it really comes down to a lot of little details that the story team needs to focus on so that it all feels like a coherent world. And then it very much also depends on whether they want the player to be their own character, like without any restrictions on personality, or like in The Witcher, if they want to put them in a specific role, which then of course also probably to some extent limits how the character would react, right? So then you don't have to let it branch out endlessly, but hopefully can restrict it a little bit more based on what the character would want. And yeah, things like that you can decide who to interact with, when to interact with them. Things like side quests, probably an important part there. Yeah, hard to say. Jordan.
No, I think you've said a lot of good things that we can talk more about. But Patrick, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like what you're saying. And I think already in that response, right, there are like all of these subcategories of interactivity. I think I sometimes resist that as a term because it comes to mean like such a huge spectrum of things. Like on the one hand, it's something like, you know, hyperlinks or limited pre-authored choices. And they're basically like you're tracing the pathways of somebody else's thinking, right? So there's like, it's more similar, I think, to fiction or to kind of print fiction than is sometimes admitted. But then there are forms of interactivity that are really like open-ended and improvisational. Like I design alternate reality games in addition to video games. And in those cases, there's so many opportunities, not just for having pre-scripted decision-making, you know, branching choices, but to like really listen to what an audience is doing and respond in real time in fully improvisational ways. So it's really useful as designers to keep coming up with a fine-tuned vocabulary for how to describe different qualities or different pleasures of interactivity.
One thing, maybe there's one game that recently came out, not sure how it's called, Through Your Eyes, I think. So it's basically, you have a VR headset on, or you can also play it with the mouse. And then you look around and you have a limited amount of time in each scene where you can look, and when you blink, the scene switches. And I think you could make a totally linear game, but it's an interactive experience, right? Because depending on where you look, you will have a different experience, even though it's all the same story.
It's called Before Your Eyes. I've sent a link to Amy and she'll share one. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting example. I don't think I'd heard of a game before that you controlled by blinking. That's definitely a really interesting experiment. Patrick, you mentioned augmented reality. We will definitely get to that in a minute because that's a whole different kind of storytelling. But Philomena, you mentioned kind of world building and side quests and things like that. And we had a comment from Ashlyn who said a lot of BioWare games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age have amazing party banter, which I think advances character relationships in an interesting way. So yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about kind of side characters and world building and side quests and things. How can all of those add to a narrative in a game?
Yeah, just probably by making the world more cohesive, by like giving you little story information bits, for example, about the past of the world, perspectives of other characters, how they react to what you do, and where that puts you inside that world. Do they see you as the good guy, as the bad guy? What are you to them, and who are you in this world?
Patrick, can you think of any parallels with the way we tell stories in other media that work with this kind of the idea of side characters and world building and side quests and things?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the history of the novel, minor characters are a really huge part of that, right? Because you're moving from the much more kind of controlled storytelling of something like a fable to a much longer print text that now suddenly has sometimes hundreds of characters. I mean, you think of something like Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, to take a very extreme example of a kind of encyclopedic novel that literally has hundreds of characters. I do think, it feels different in games when, say, you encounter queer characters in Breath of the Wild or something that maybe you didn't expect from a mainstream release of that sort, or to go with the banter idea that Ashlyn brought up, the kind of banter that happens in the background of the Uncharted games, for instance, like gives like a completely different texture to the world, even if the narrative is progressing in terms of plot in a very linear fashion. So those kinds of qualities, everything from kind of like alternative characters or minor characters to voice acting, can go a really long way toward moving from a story to a world.
I think the side quest is an interesting question because, they're optional, right? So it's kind of like this discussion we had about multilinearity and the player being able to choose what story they had. I guess that's a way to give players the option to get more story if they want. But does that not come into conflict of the idea of the story that the storyteller wants to tell? Do people who want to tell stories in games have to kind of get over this idea of being able to feed a particular story to the player and just accept that things are going to be messier than that?
Hard to say. So I definitely feel that people who really want to tell a story in a game probably would like people to do all the side quests, and probably feel like, you haven't even seen what you're really doing if you haven't heard from these people and these people. So it can be conflicting. I think it can be hard to find a good balance between trying to telling your story and having the game really being fun to play. And we're still investigating and trying out new approaches on how to best combine the two things, right? I keep being surprised at new storytelling techniques every year.
Yeah, let's talk about some more kind of new kinds of ways of telling stories in games. You mentioned Before Your Eyes, Philomena. Can you think of any other interesting or experimental games as far as the ways that they tell story? What kind of formats are we seeing that we haven't really seen before? Patrick, it seems like you might have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of interesting experiments in the game space, and certainly games became more experimental around 2007, 2008, when you had like an explosion of like the art game scene. You have games like Her Story, for instance, right, where you're like moving through a database and basically like using a search function as a way of revealing pieces of video that you didn't have before. So that's maybe an extreme example. Or I was just talking to a friend recently about a much older game called Facade, in which it's basically a Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf situation, where you show up at a dinner party with a couple that's clearly been arguing and you have to mediate between them, but there aren't pre-made decision choices, right? You're typing in statements into a chat field and an AI system is responding to you, which produces a very different feeling of drama and story beats and stuff like that. So those are two kind of fringe experimental examples, but I think they point toward directions that we might take. I would also add that like something games do that, maybe to reiterate what I said before, is like games are long often. Like, yeah, you can find 2 or 3 hour games, but they're enormous. Like a standard novel is 60,000 to 100,000 words. Disco Elysium, which came out last year, there was another version that came out this year, had a script that was over 1 million words long. And I don't think that that's just a difference of quantity, it's a difference of quality, because when you get up to 1 million words, you're no longer reading that start to finish. You're probably not playing that in a single sitting or even 2 sittings. So you're living with it in a way that is maybe more akin to television seriality than it is to standard storytelling or to text or something like that. And then we have even longer games. Just to throw out one last example, there's another game called The Longing, which happens over 400 days in real time. And so you have to you don't have to, it's an idle game, so you don't have to be there playing it at every given moment, but it doesn't end until over a year has passed.
and it's a game about waiting. I never would have thought about doing a game about waiting. It's really a really cool example. There's one cool game from Switzerland which is called Letters, and that is basically an interactive story that you experience through letters and emails that you send like to a friend in Russia. So it's kind of a story between a Swiss girl and a Russian girl, and like several years of them exchanging like emails and letters, and you are basically this little person that goes through all of everything that they have written, and certain words can be picked up and like used with other words or with images to unlock the way. And then you make decisions sometimes that you are probably not even aware that they are decisions, which is something that really interests me. I don't really like it when games are like making it super obvious. This goes this way and this goes this way. I really like it when there's like subtle decision making, and then you go down a story path, but you don't even know. Yeah, I think that that game is a good example for that.
Yeah, on that, what Philomena just said, an example that I would mention is Bury Me, My Love, which is a phone game where you play as, I think, the husband of someone who is a refugee. And you are just texting them to kind of answer questions of what, you know, they're asking, what should I do at this point? Like, should I try and get on this plane or should I go this other way? And you're texting them and you kind of, you don't know everything that's going on. They're maybe not giving you the full truth, and the choices that you make it isn't clear what direction things are going in. The game doesn't tell you that gave you 5 points to this thing or -5 points to that thing. So it's really interesting for that kind of obfuscated what's going on beneath the surface. So that's definitely an interesting one, and I'll put a link so that Irmi can share it. I also wanted to mention that the Longing is a really interesting game, and I first saw that at Adventure X, which is an event that happens here in the UK, which is all about narrative games. So if people are interested in narrative games, then that is something to check out as well. We have a question from Chloe, which is kind of a how-to. How do you go about creating the story for a game? Is it making a basic storyline with possible endings and then coming up with smaller interactions that develop depth? For example, Philomena, you have experience making games. Is that how you make a story for a game?
So maybe currently with the new game, because that's quite of a mix between both approaches, because we have like an overarching story, but it also has emergent gameplay within that storyline, basically. So it's really complicated to make a good overarching story and like a believable world with like lore and everything. So we ended up consulting with a fantasy author who is now helping us to fill all the holes in our stories, because players will definitely find them. So he's helping us to really build the world around and everything that happened in this world before, even though much of it will not be visible in the game, probably. So like you will find some little bits and pieces of what happened, but it's kept pretty open to your interpretation also. But for us as developers, it really helps to implement all the other mechanics, thinking about what materials these people are using, what the buildings should look like, all these kinds of things. That is how we approach it this time. Let's see how it turns out.
It's looking good. I'm excited to play it.
Thank you.
Patrick, do you have thoughts on how you go about writing a story for a game?
Yeah, I mean, I oftentimes, start with the central story, like for making an alternate reality game, for instance, and then think about all of the characters who are in that world and like what trajectories they have, and eventually how to tie those in potentially to the main narrative, or at least expand how the political and economic and cultural reality of that world operates relative to those characters. I'm working on a video game right now with a collaborator, and a lot of what we're thinking about, again, is not just the storyline, but the forms of dissensus and disagreement within that world that we can animate through a series of conversations that are optional, but that in many ways are central to the game that we're working on. So that idea of disagreement, of dissensus, of like a really vibrant culture is something that's like difficult to simulate or replicate, but so wonderful when it works in a game. I mean, I'll go back to Disco Elysium as an example, of a game that's maybe 40 hours long, but in which there are so many divergences from the main narrative. And that's where the beauty of the game lies, really, is in those like gritty, everyday, ordinary sort of encounters.
So maybe one example when we do emergent game design or emergent storytelling is that we think about how players will talk about the game. So what kind of stories would they tell? And then we each write down like 3 or 4 examples of what we would like to hear and how that would be provoked to actually happen by certain game mechanics.
Oh, interesting. Chloe, who asked that question, if you want some examples of people who write stories for games, explaining how they did it, I actually have a podcast called Talking Simulator where I interview game makers, and some of them are narrative designers who talk about the process with specific games, like Astrologaster, which is another good experimental format that I should have mentioned earlier, a game where you play as a real life doctor. So it's a kind of it's a historical game, but it's also a comedy. Dr. Simon Foreman, who was an Elizabethan quote unquote doctor who helped his clients by reading the stars. So the way you kind of play the game is you read the stars and you pick an answer to their problem that they come to you with. And that's a really interesting one. I interviewed the writer for that, Catherine Neal, and that's one of the episodes. I will put a link to that in the chat as well. We have another question. This one from Bruno, who asks, games are sort of a behavioral lab. How do you see the spillover effect for players from games to real life? This is obviously something that comes up a lot, generally with the topic of violence. A lot of games, especially the ones that get the most attention, are quite violent. People wonder whether that has an effect on people's mentality after they play a lot of these kinds of games. But I guess the same can be true with a game that's very sad. Does it make you sad in real life? That kind of thing. Does it then change your behavior in any way? Patrick, you clearly have thoughts on this one.
Yeah, my last book that I published entitled Experimental Games takes up the history of this question in some ways. And one of the places that I think you can tie this back to is behavioral economics. So behavioral economics, weirdly enough, right, starts to use games as a way of nudging people and altering behaviors. And so there are ways in which the social sciences historically have taken up games to do just this sort of thing. We, of course, have serious games as another kind of category where people make games about political issues or about social issues. And oftentimes the intention is not just to represent those issues, but also try to make some kind of difference in them. So like we worked on a game about climate change called Terrarium. And that game really was intended to change the habits and the behaviors of people via climate change who were playing that game. But there's so many ways now that games are integrated into the metaphors that we use on a daily basis, the ways in which we encounter the world. If like seeing through cinema was such an important part of the mid-20th century, it's not that games like have replaced every other form, but in the early 21st century, games have become like the metaphors and the forms that so many of us live by.
I think games are mostly very strong at giving you empathy for something because you are in the specific situation. We just mentioned political examples such as, for example, Papers, Please, where you are in the role of somebody who controls passports of people who want to get into a country and have to decide if you let them in or if you reject them. And at the beginning, that all looks pretty simple, but you soon realize that your own family and your own life is also on the line. And you really want to help somebody, but you're putting your family in danger. And that is when it gets really interesting to put you in that moral situation that you maybe would never experience otherwise if it weren't for a game. And we as game designers and narrative designers are the ones that actually decide what kinds of experiences we want people to live through, right? So it would be a shame if it were just shooter games.
Do you think that the way that games can have this effect on us is unique compared to, so Patrick, you mentioned film and kind of seeing the world through film. I think a lot of people like to think that games are uniquely able to do this. to kind of affect us in this way, and maybe use that as a scare tactic. You know, children shouldn't be playing video games because they have this unique effect on your brain. Would you say that that was true, or can books and films also do this to people?
I think it depends on how you're trained, right? How you're trained to read, how you're trained to view. Like these things don't happen naturalistically. Like we all have experiences of pop culture, obviously, but I think, you know, like there were times when something like a powerful documentary could change people's behavior. I don't know that that's particularly true anymore. There are exceptions to this, but there are also like arguments against what those forms of comparatively passive entertainment, because oftentimes they are entertainment even when they take on very serious topics, can do. One thing that I'm really excited about with games in an ongoing way is that they force you to do stuff, right? The game doesn't move forward unless you're interacting, as we've talked about, or unless you're producing a series of mechanics or interpretations. You can't just sit back passively and watch like a harrowing war film while you're having dinner and then go back to what you were doing anyway, right? I mean, there are forms of immersiveness that are different from the forms of immersiveness in these other forms, and I see a value in those, in part because, you know, you're repeating, you're habituating, right? I mean, behavior doesn't change unless you've practiced it for a significant amount of time, sometimes a month or 2 months, or there's a quality of interaction and experience. And that word experience is something that I think games give us. It's not an experience of the real world. There's still simulations, there's still selective models in some cases, but they really, you know, and this is maybe my like faith in games rather than some kind of objective statement, but I do have a faith in certain kinds of games being able to like rewire us in subtle ways.
I also think it really depends on how you interact with the medium and, for example, how much you identify with the character. So I've had books where I identify more with the character and get more out of the book than with certain games. So there's many different factors coming into play.
Absolutely. And since Patrick mentioned his book, I would be remiss if I did not mention mine again. My book is basically a look at how we can look at games as thought experiments, philosophical thought experiments, because they are kind of simulations. You can explore thought experiments in a way that you can't do in real life. For instance, what Patrick said about the fact that you have to actually act and that you can feel complicit in your actions is something I discuss in the book. I interviewed Brenda Romero, who made the game Train. She talks a lot about that kind of thing. So we'll put some links to that as well in the chat. But now we've been so positive about games and the power that they have to tell stories. Let's talk about some of their shortcomings, or some of the ways that they can improve, maybe. So the limitations of games when it comes to narrative. We've talked about some of the preconceptions that people have of games. One of them is that you just can't tell a good story in games. There are a lot of people who will write long articles telling you that we haven't got good stories in games yet. Why do people think that? Why is that such a strong belief that still exists out there? Philomena, what do you think?
Probably because they think that a very good story has to be one specific thing. I mean, of course, if you compare a game to a book, it's not going to be the same thing. And if the story in a book is what you are really trying to achieve, then a book is probably the best medium to do that. I think we have gotten plenty of good stories in games. They're just a bit different. And I think they don't have to be exactly the same as in a movie or in a book.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this is like largely a class thing in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, people will celebrate the opera or literature. And look, I'm in an English department, so I read plenty of novels. But the best games that we have now are in every way as compelling, or at least ambitious, as these previous art forms. So I think it's just a question of exposure, and that's not true generally for like younger folks who have grown up playing video games. So it's also partially a generational thing.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. I wonder if there is an effect from maybe generationally, so maybe from generations past, of the expectations that people have of games. So even players themselves, you know, people who play a lot of video games, who play the kind of big budget stuff that gets advertised to us on the sides of buses, at least here in the UK. Do they come to games with these expectations that, for instance, it's going to be fun? they're going to be able to win, and the choices that they make will have consequences. And do those expectations that we know a lot of players have constrain games as far as the kinds of stories that we can tell?
Totally. I think so, yeah. It would be very interesting to play more games that just have the goal to make you sad, right? It would open up a lot more narrative tools and storylines. If it always has to be fun and rewarding, I mean, that's probably just what we think games are, but I think they don't have to be just that. And I think people are starting to understand that more. So we have seen so many cool indie game examples, and also some from bigger studios where I think they're really pushing the boundaries. And sometimes people have to see it and experience it to actually feel that, okay, yeah, I don't have to have fun all the time to get an experience out of that.
What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the way that the meanings around the word game have exploded, right? I mean, the number of genres that we have now compared to like the earlier moments of the arcade or the Atari VCS or the earliest kind of Nintendo and Sega systems, where many games were still kind of like oriented around hand-eye coordination and a very limited number of genres, usually ones that were sort of advertised or marketed toward young white men. And there's been a diversification of like the players of games, slowly the designers and developers too, though there's a huge disparity there. But I think, you know, even just like thinking, as you're talking about, Philomena, like how many different kinds of experiences you can have in games that you couldn't have before. Like I still think, at least in the United States, there's a real overemphasis on competition as a mode. I mean, this is like, you know, competition is kind of a national religion here. So I think it bleeds into games in inordinate amount of the time. I mean, competition can be fine in certain contexts, but if it's making up 90 or 95% of games, you're missing out on a lot of experiences of improvisation, of role playing, of storytelling, of you know, slice of life, ordinary experiences, and things like that.
I mean, just look at stuff like Second Life, which is like the expanded version of Sims, right? Which is like an MMO where you have an alternate life and an alternate house, and you can design your character, and yeah, you basically just live a second life. I mean, if we can do that, I think we can do a lot of things.
Perhaps relevant to that, Chloe asks, is the experience factor one of the biggest draws to bring people to play a game?
Probably. Yeah, I think so, because yeah, that's what's unique to the medium, right? That it tells you that you get to be a character, or you get to be in a certain world yourself.
Mm-hmm. Virtual tourism, I often think of it as.
Yeah, right. I actually once was at an interactive theater where like a story was told, but then everybody who participated also logged into, I think it was GTA. And then we had a tour guide who walked all of our avatars through the city, and then we all had to steal a car and drive after him, and he continued to tell the story while we did that. And then of course some people fell off the bridge and it got a bit hectic, but that was a very interesting, yeah, new kind of combining these two mediums.
Patrick, you have anything to add?
I mean, just the like, you know, one can have experiences in many different forms, right? I mean, insofar as like experience has to do with your like sensory reaction to something, right? I mean, I can feel like I know a character, or people will joke around about like, you know, their friends in television shows whom they've like lived with over the course of like a decade and many seasons. So there are, I think there are other places where you can have experiences, but there is something about the literally hands-on, you know, hand-eye dimension of games, the kind of the feedback loop that they create, that produces a sense that's closer to what we would say, you know, we do when we like travel and have an experience of a new place or something like that.
So, Patrick, you mentioned that games have diversified, and that is definitely true. I mean, there are a lot more kinds of stories being told in games, but are there any topics that are kind of off limits? Are there any kinds of stories that we shouldn't tell in games?
You know, I don't know that there are like things that are completely off the table in terms of content. I do think that there are things that we haven't seen so far, right? Like one example would be in literature, you have novels like Ulysses or Gravity's Rainbow, right? I mentioned encyclopedic novels before. Like, I don't know that we have a video game that's like an equivalent of an encyclopedic text. Or again, I was talking to a friend about 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was thinking about like, well, what would like a video game equivalent of something that was so long and to some people boring, but also meditative, what would that look like? And would an audience that was trained to have a lot of responsiveness still be able to operate reflectively within that kind of space, without any kind of instrumentality at play? So, I think that there are like places that we can go to in other formats to think about what's missing. And sometimes there's a good reason for why that's missing, or other times it is like an interesting prompt for an artist to try their hand at doing this difficult crossover.
I think that if you look at really, really small games, like by small creators, for example, on itch.io or something, I'm sure you will find games about many, many different topics and aspects that we just don't know about because they haven't been that big. But I think you can mostly have all kinds of content that you want. It just really depends on how you present it, and yeah, if it's tastefully discussed, whatever the topic might be that is a bit off limits nowadays still.
And this is something that we kind of talked about before we started the panel, a question that I have a lot, which is, where are the romantic comedies in video games? Why are there some genres that are just missing? Is it just that you can't fit that kind of thing into the interactive format? It just wouldn't work?
Isn't there like, what was the game called? Dream Daddy Simulator, where you date, where you are a dad and you date other dads. So I think that would count maybe as romantic comedy.
Yeah, I mean, like I would throw in like a lot of dating sims in this, or even visual novels in some ways, like totally map onto romantic comedies, right? I mean, especially if you think like comedy as a genre isn't necessarily funny, it just has to do with like a clear resolution in the end, and we have a lot of that in like in visual novels in particular. But it's true, it feels different from like romantic comedies with like actor leads in a film or something like that. But we have, like we have other comedic genres like fumblecore, for instance, so something like Quap or or Octodad or something like that.
Getting over it.
What's that?
Right? Getting over it.
Yeah, getting over it. Yep. Like really difficult, like sadistically difficult games that are funny because like you can't possibly muster an awesome performance unless you're that one person on YouTube that somehow has like speed run the game in an amazing way. But yeah, I mean, we have like other kinds of genres, like the pejorative category of like walking simulators, which I actually like love as a genre designation. I think we should continue to own that. And there are like, now we have like true walking simulators, right? Like Death Stranding is like an actual walking simulator. Like it's not just about like traversing space, whatever. Like those earlier games were not walking simulators. Like in Death Stranding, like you're balancing the load on your back and literally like controlling your steps. Or Quap is another fumblecore game, literally requires you to control like all of these muscles in your leg. And then like the last genre that I would throw out would be something like slice of life, like that exists in manga and anime, but there's like interesting opportunities to do that with games, especially given the kind of duration that you have in a game.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a really, really great place to end this conversation and to hand back to Irmi, unless there are any more questions from the audience, but I think we got through them all. Thank you so much, Philomena and Patrick, both of you. This was a fascinating conversation. And for people asking, yes, this has been recorded, so you can watch it back on the YouTube channel of the Goethe-Institut and on the Facebook channel as well. So thank you again, you two. Obviously, we're not in a real event, but I'll clap for you.
Thank you
so
too.
much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I cannot thank all of you enough. This was one of the most fascinating things I have watched in a very, very long time. Thank you, thank you, Thank you. And yes, please check our web pages for a link to the video.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice evening or lunch.